takes more than that.
Oh. Please turn on the recording.
All right. We're going to be starting a book study on Philippians. So if you have your Bible, now there's some Bibles in the back corner. There's some right here if anybody wants to pass them around. And then I also put them on the screen just to make sure we've got them all. And we're doing this, so I guess shirt sleeves okay? Just, I need a shirt and shoes. We're good. All right, good. Okay. We're actually going to spend today on verse 1, next Sunday on verse 1, and the third Sunday on verse 1. So just to give you an overview, we want to look at three parts of Philippians 1. We're going to start with Philippi, which is the name of the town today. Next week, we're going to look at Paul and Timothy and how they got there, because they really didn't want to go there. We're going to get into the whole issue of how God directs you in your life, because they got some miscues and they kind of fought against it, but they actually ended up in Philippi. And then when they got there, there's some holy people that Paul writes about. We're going to try to see who these holy people are and see if any of us look like them. That'll be the third Sunday. And so those are our first three lessons then as we get into the new year. So what I want to focus on today, and I don't have my clicker, so we'll have to do it by hand, is I want to focus on the actual town of Philippi. This is a hard question. Now let me start. After whom do you think the town is named? Did you enjoy that from England? After whom? That's good. Who's the town named after? We don't do that here. After whom is the town named? Okay. Who do you think is named for Philippi? Or named after? Philip. Good. Chris got it. All right. About the 4th century BC, the father of Alexander the Great is named Philip of Macedon. And that's the town named after. It goes into a decline. And by the time that it surfaces in Paul's second journey, it's a Roman colony. Now, if you look at this for just a second, Paul's second journey, he's starting in that. Have you all ever heard of a country named Syria? We're back again. He starts in Antioch, which was kind of the metro area of the Middle East at that time. That's where the Roman troops were garrisoned. That's where the commercial center was. And he takes off again to go through what we now call Turkey. He gets up here, and he gets to the edge of Turkey, a place called Troas, and he does something he had never done before in the history of the church. He leaves what's called Asia, and he goes over to Greece, which is Europe. So one of the reasons I like to study about Philippians is it's the first church in Europe, which many of us, most of us, came from, Europe heritage, without which we probably wouldn't have had the benefit of being here today. So pretty significant that Paul decides to go into Europe, Philippi. Now let's look at Philippi. As I said, it was a Greek settlement, but in 40 BC, there is a big confrontation during the Roman Civil War. Now, so after Julius Caesar's assassinated, and by the way, who assassinated him? Brutus, and who was his buddy? Cassius. Everybody got that? So Brutus and Cassius team up, and back then what the Romans would do is they would play all over the European board and fight each other. And two guys team up to track them down and to fight them. One guy's name is Mark Antony, who later came to know which person in Egypt? Cleopatra. Anybody seen that? Anthony and Cleopatra? And he has a great play. Shakespeare wrote that one. And he teams up with a guy who's the nephew of Julius Caesar, and his name is Octavian. So Octavian and Anthony take on Cassius and Brutus. And they have a battle in a town called Philippi, and that's where the Octavian forces win. So that's really the establishment then of the Roman Empire. Octavian then changes his name to Augustus Caesar. And that's the beginning of the Roman Empire. But the battle and the victory took place in Philippi. So to commemorate that, they established Philippi as a Roman colony, garrisoned mostly by Gentiles, that's us, very few Jews, and it's a military town. And that becomes the target where Paul's going. Now, everything that happens in the book of Philippians, you've got to have a Roman context. I mean, the Roman Empire controlled the known world. Can everybody see Africa? Africa back then was simply this strip of land. It wasn't the whole continent. And all of northern Africa was settled by whom? Greeks. So if you went to Africa back then, you would run into Greek folks. So it wasn't what we typically think of Africa. So what's happening is that the Romans had divided the empire up into different areas to govern. And so the place he's going to is Macedonia, which is now today northern Greece. Everybody got that? Okay. How did he get there? This is the famous Ignatian Way. Have you heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? I don't know how the Romans did it, because if you go to Rome today, you can't go anyplace. I mean, you just go around in circles. You're wondering how in the world they survived. But back then, they had a road that was 500 miles long, going from the Bosporus Straits to Rome. And this was the Ignatian Way. What the Romans did is made it easy to get around. And Paul used this road to go to Philippi. It went right through Philippi, and that gave Philippi its prominence because it was right on the Ignatian Way. Here's a picture of Philippi today. It's laid out as a typical Roman city, which meant it's not like Atlanta. You know, in Atlanta, all the roads do this. Well, everything in a Roman city was laid out in angles. So you knew where you were going. It had its amphitheater, because you got to have plays, you got to have all that stuff going on. And then guess what else the Romans provided? If you were walking down the street and you had the urge, if you go to any Roman ruin today, you'll see these public facilities. And so people would just come along the side, and if they had an urge, they just kind of used them. And wasn't that nice? It kept it off the streets. All right, now here's the overview. Paul's going to show up in Philippi, this Roman colony, and he's going to meet some ladies. And that's why I like this book so much, because these ladies really become to take charge, make it happen, leaders that's going to put this church in motion. And you notice one of the key people that he meets and kicks his thing off is dressed in what? Purple. And what's her name? Lydia. So he's going to meet Lydia and some folks out by a stream, and then he's going to have a second episode. He's going to get thrown in prison, and he's going to meet the Roman guards and going to have a nice experience in the prison. And then he's going to go away for 12 years. And in 62 AD, he's now in Rome, shackled with a guard, writing letters. And so what you're going to read in Philippians is a letter he writes back to the church he established in Philippi 12 years later. Everybody see that? And this is right before Nero comes on the scene, and you recall what Nero did. When Rome had a fire, he blamed it on the Christians, and he pulled Paul out of prison and said, "You're going to pay for it," and he chopped his head off. So Paul's got about one more year in his life on earth after he writes this letter. So the letter you read is to the church that he established in Philippi, and during the early years of church history, it was a center. If you go there today, you have a basilica, the ruins, and so forth. So the church had a major influence on the early universal church development. Now, let's kind of look at this in context. The significance to me of Paul going to Philippi is he's taking the gospel from what was called Asia here, and he's going to Europe. And the thing that separated back then and still today Asia from Europe is the Bosporus Straits. Does everybody see that? It's a narrow strait. Has anybody been to Istanbul, Constantinople? Okay. Narrow straits. It goes into a sea, and then you have the Dardanelles. You know, the Dardanelles is where Winston Churchill got in trouble in World War I, and then remember the movie Gallipoli? What was it? Gallipoli? Anybody see that movie? During World War I, the Australians were there and they got creamed and killed, and so that occurred right here. Dardanelles. And anybody remember Helen of Troy? Remember Helen? Back during the... Are you all with me on this? Helen of Troy. All right. She hangs out right in here. So Troy is right there. So it's got a lot of history. Is everybody with me on this? All right. So this small little slice of water separated Asia from Europe. And that's how it was for hundreds of years, that separation. What Paul's going to do is go across that and actually bridge the gospel into Europe. Verses 8. Is everybody? So that's significant. Just to put it another way. Am I going to share that Philip of Macedon was Alexander the Great's father? Is that right? Okay. So this is another picture. Now the Dardanelles are an interesting strait down here because in 400 BC, the Persians decided to come over and conquer Greeks. Remember that? And there was a Persian king by the name of Xerxes. Who was married to Xerxes? Esther. Well, Xerxes is one wild guy, and he decides that he's going to take on the Greeks. He actually goes here and he builds a bridge across the Dardanelles. And that's how he gets his army over into Greece. And they're defeated at Marathon, and therefore we had the first Peachtree Road Race. Remember the Marathon? And then what happens is, because he stirs up a hornet's nest, 150 years later there's a guy named Alexander who branded himself the Great. He decides to go back the other way. So he comes over and then ends up conquering most of the Middle East all the way to India. So my point in this is a very significant piece of land. And it separated the east from the west. So the significance for us in the lesson is Paul is going to take the gospel from the east to the west. Now let's have a context for what I mean by east. When Jesus walked on planet Earth, he lived in what was then called Israel or Palestine, a Roman province. This is what the east would have looked like where the gospel started, where Christianity started. They had kings and kingdoms. In other words, the Egyptians had their pharaohs, Israel had their kings, Assyria had their king, Babylonia and the Persians. Has anybody ever lived in a dictatorial country or dictatorship or some of that? Tell us about it.
I mean, I've been in Beijing since July. Very much. They consider themselves now to have an elected government, but not really. It's they've still got pictures of Mao everywhere. Very subservient population. Very straight and narrow down the line. Very rule oriented. Some of the rules are arbitrary. Some of the things that they do to their citizens are fairly arbitrary. Interesting.
Right. And the key thing is that when the king speaks, it happens.
Yes.
That's the context of where the gospel started. Now, look at the religion. In 2000 BC is when Abraham shows up from Iraq into Israel. We became Israel. He was the patriarch. Moses then takes him into the promised land at 1500 BC, and he starts writing the Old Testament. Okay, so about 1500 BC. David comes along and expands in Israel about 1000 BC. And in parallel to that, you have Hinduism that was going on in India about 2000 BC. And that's when they started writing the Hindu writings. Anybody know what they're called? The Veda? Okay. But what you find in Hinduism, and then Buddha was a Hindu follower and then decided to establish his own way about 500 BC. And he goes actually into China and establishes a new way. Zoroastrianism was something the Persians came up with to explain good and evil in the world. Now, when you look at these religions, what you see is a lot of mysticism. Now, what do I mean by mysticism? Under Hinduism, there was no such thing as bad or evil. It was all an illusion. So you separate your mind, how you think and view things, from the real world. It's a disconnect. It's mystical. And today, if you go to certain parts of our country, there's a recycling of mysticism. Under what? What are some of the things where you kind of get into your inner self and try to develop what's there? New Age. It's Hinduism recycled. Still mystical, right? Now, the point of going through all this is that's where the gospel started. The gospel was really a Jewish sect that had found its Messiah. Okay? So there was a context for Jesus as the Messiah in this Eastern culture where everything was controlled by kings and laid out. Now let's look at the West that Paul is going into now on this journey. And really the center of Western culture was in Greece. First of all, when you were in school, did you read about all the Greek and Roman gods? Did you have to memorize those? All right, so who was the top Greek god?
Zeus.
And the Roman counterpart?
Jupiter.
Jupiter. The whole idea of the Greek gods and the Roman gods was everything's being controlled by these gods. And to make sure that you had rain, you got pregnant, your crops came along, or that you won a battle, you'd find a god whose job it was to run that area, and then you worship him and hope that it turned out all right. That was their system of thinking. How many gods did they have? Many. In fact, the use of the word pagan was first referred to as to Christians. You know why? They wouldn't accept the gods. So they were called pagans by the Romans. Now, let's go to Greece. Democracy started on planet Earth under Pericles in Athens, about 500 BC. So suddenly, instead of having the king in charge, they now have a bunch of people getting together, and guess what they did? They voted. Can you imagine the feeling of voting on an issue when you've never had that before in your life? That started in Athens in 500 BC. Then you have Homer. Homer came along about 800 BC, and did everybody read Homer in high school? All right. He actually wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all of these stories that took place in Greece. Herodias was the father of history. Anybody major in history? Would you like to? The point is, over a period of about 200 years, all of these Greek guys surface. Anybody see the big fat Greek wedding? All right, all these Greek people surface, and they really provide the underpinnings of our culture, our Western culture, all at one time. Herodias, Hippocrates, what's his name? The father of medicine. And today when you go into medicine, you take a Hippocratic oath, Greek guy. Euclid and Pythagoras. Pythagoras. Anybody know the Pythagoras theorem?
A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Look at this guy. I mean, isn't it amazing what you can take from Greek culture and apply? You just got that down. And then you had the three biggest philosophers in the history of the world, all came one after the other. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle was also the coach of Alexander the Great. And what was their big thing, if you had to summarize the philosophers? Reason, think, use your mind. So notice now, instead of the mysticism of the East, there's a culture that's developed that says use your mind, think, apply. So the question becomes, question one. What challenges would Paul face going from an Eastern to a Western culture? What do you think? All right, they want answers. You can't just show up and refer to Jesus as the Messiah. You can't just show up and say he's talked about in the Old Testament. You can't just show up and, I mean, they're going to want to know why, right? They got to think. What else? What other challenges?
Multiple gods versus
Yeah,
single God.
yeah. The monotheism that existed in Israel now is totally gone. And you walk down. Has anybody been to the Roman Forum in Rome? And you see where all the statues of the gods were. I mean, they're all over the place. And so now you're going into God is one of many gods kind of thing. So a lot of big challenges. Question 2. Since we're here today, 2,000 years later, as a Christian fellowship group, Paul must have been successful to some degree. So the question is, what enabled Paul and Christianity to be successful in a Western culture? What do you think?
Wasn't he very well educated? I mean, like super smart, so he could go into that society.
He actually went to the Harvard of the East. That's a joke, but it was in Jerusalem. He was tutored by, remember the guy's name?
No.
The point is,
No,
what's that?
I'm not that smart, but I heard Paul was.
This is kind of interesting. The disciples didn't have the education because they were mostly people of the street. So when God is trying to expand now Christianity to the Western world especially, he picks up one of the brightest, most highly educated people in Israel by the name of Paul. And Paul's the one who's got the task now to bring this message in.
Paul was also a skeptic, so
Okay.
he argued the other side. So I think
So you're saying sometimes it's helpful if you come into Christianity having looked at it from a skeptical standpoint. That's a plus. So he wasn't church early in life. In fact, he tried to kill folks. Any other?
Wasn't he Western?
Paul?
Yeah.
Where was he from? Tarsus, which was still in Asia.
But he wasn't, but he wasn't Jewish.
Yeah, he was Jew.
Or was he?
Yes, yes. Okay? All right. Well, let's look at what I want to do today in today's lesson. I want to look at 2 examples of why I think Christianity and Paul was successful in this context, and I want to apply them to our class. Now, we're going to come back and study this in much more detail, but I just want to give you a snapshot. In Acts 17, we're going to read about what Paul did when he showed up in these different parts of Greece. One of the reasons Paul and Christianity was successful in a Western culture is he tended to meet people where they are. Okay? So this is a little episode where he goes to Athens at the Areopagus, and he stands up and he says, I see that you people are very religious. So he's trying to connect with them. Has anybody been to an Athens football game recently? There used to be a guy, and I don't want to ever put anybody down, but I always get embarrassed when I go. It was a Turner Burn guy, right before you go into the stadium, who was preaching, Turner Burn. Have you experienced that?
Not yesterday.
My point is, sometimes in our insensitivity, we just kind of lambast people, turn or burn. Paul never did that. The thing he does is he engages people where they are. These are all these philosophers. These are all the Greek people that are very reasonable, thoughtful. And he says, I see you're very religious. Then he says, let me tell you about the God among all the gods who made everything. And then at the end of this encounter, look what he says. He quotes one of their own poets. He says, one of your own poets says, we are his offspring. Does that make sense? Now, let's talk about our class. We have people all over the board in our class. Christianity and Christ and a relationship with him always comes back to meeting you where you're at. So if you're just here kind of saying, well, I'm just kind of exploring this thing, that's great. That's right where you should be. If some of you are way down here and you're saying, gee, I'm into heavy study, and that's great, because what we want to do this year is we want to ask God to meet us each where we're at. That's the key to a relationship with Christ. Not trying to be somebody you're not trying to be what somebody else is, but just saying, here I am, and our goal this year in the class is simply to move us from where we are to a greater relationship with Christ. And we're going to do that by meeting each person where they're at. And that's what Paul did. and he became infinitely successful with that approach. Another approach he took, number 2, responding to man's universal need. Now, this is a little episode in Philippi. There's a jailer there who goes through an earthquake, and in the middle of that, he turns to them and he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Does that mean he was a Baptist? Sometimes we think that's a religious term. Are you saved? That's not what this Roman jailer had on his mind. What do you think he was referring to? If you've lived through an earthquake that's demolished your prison and all the prisoners have escaped, what's the context for saying, "What must I do to be saved?" Yeah, he's going to lose his life. And he just turned to these guys and said, "Help me out." And he's reflecting this universal need. And then look how they respond. "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved." Well, what did he know about the Lord Jesus? Nothing. So what do they have to do? Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in the home. In other words, it's not just praying a prayer and saying, "Help me." It's understanding who this God is that is to help you. And therefore, we are always successful when we respond to man's universal need. Pascal was a French philosopher and in the 1700s, and he said there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man that can only be filled by God himself. Is that true in China?
Yes.
Is that true in Buckhead? Is that true in Chile? Yeah. There's this universal need, and Paul was able to speak to that need. Now, he was able to speak to that need for 2 reasons. And I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to connect some dots. He writes another letter to the church at Rome, and he says there's 2 ways that all people in the world have heard about God, no matter where they are and when they lived. Whether they lived in China, India, wherever it is. First of all, he says that since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it known to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. In other words, he's planted within each person the capacity to look at creation and reach a conclusion that there must be a creator. Creation means creator. He's planted that insight into each person no matter when they've lived or where they've lived. What's the idea behind having that thought there? If you know there's a creator, what should you do? Seek him. So this Roman jailer is saying, "I want to be saved," and he probably had the experience of being out there a night in Philippi, looking up at the stars, realizing that there must be a creator. And that's one of the witnesses that God has put in the world, the creator. There is a creator behind the creation. And that witness then means that all people are without excuse. Nobody's ever lived with a mental capacity that's normal who is without excuse, because when God then has a heart of a person seeking after them, what does he do? He responds to that. Remember the first Gentile convert in Palestine? Who was it? The Roman centurion who was from Italy. What did he know about this? He was looking at the stars. He concluded. And for many of us, we probably have gone through stages in our lives where we consider there must be a creator. And then we are prompted to look into who this creator was. There's a second witness that God has put on the planet. See this word here in Romans 2? Conscience. We just had a week with our 3.5-year-old granddaughter. And before we had that time with her, we were in Alabama, that great School of Higher Education and Learning in Birmingham. No, in Tallahassee, in Tuscaloosa. Yeah. So we're supposed to watch the kids one night, and there's a little toddler, a year-old, and then there's a 3.5-year-old. So Donna's in the bathroom, and I'm supposed to watch the kids. They're on the bed. That's my big assignment as a grandparent. I'm on the bed to watch the kids. Donna calls my name. I turn like this, and the next thing I hear is a thunk. And the 1-year-old falls out off this high bed, is lying on the floor, looking up, crying, and I'm thinking, oh no, I go to jail on this one. I mean, we've ruined our whole time. Now, this little guy is really a survivor. He's been bounced around, and it turns out he was okay. But I looked at our 3.5-year-old and I said, what happened? And guess what she said? I pushed him off. I said, why'd you do that? He was going to grab my iPad, and I didn't want him to have an iPad. Now, this little girl has an unbelievable developed conscience. Every person on planet Earth has a conscience, and when you start doing bad things, guess what happens? Something inside of you says, that's not good. And God has put that witness there. Is everybody catching it? So when Paul goes into Philippi in Greece, he's building on the creation witness, and he's building on the conscience witness. So when he shows up and starts to teach and preach, he's building on those two things. Because he recognizes man's universal need. I think many of us can respond to this idea of God's witness in our lives, and probably many of us can relate to the pilgrimage that sometimes it takes. I was raised in a conservative Christian family, and so I went to church on Sunday twice, and also had to go in the middle of the week, whether I liked it or not. And so I was getting a lot of this education early on, but my mother died of cancer when I was 16. And that was like a big curveball. And I said, you know, if there is a God, and I wasn't sure, and he allowed this to happen, I'm really not interested. So when I went to school at Georgia Tech, I was pretty much an agnostic. An agnostic means I don't know. I was the second kind of agnostic, and that was I don't care. Because I had discovered something far better, fraternity life. I'd never seen this before. You could have this much fun on the weekend. Now, this is only at Tech. I know that in certain colleges you all party all the time, but we actually have to study during the week. I worked real hard at fraternity life, and I became social chairman for 3 straight years. Really worked hard at it. Brought some of the best bands to Tech that they had at that time. But it was an interesting phenomena in that when the party was over, I discovered that there was always a Monday morning. And some of us can relate to that, right? The hedonistic lifestyle, you can't build your life around that. There's no way. At some point, there's a Monday. And I started scratching my head and said, well, there's got to be more to life than this. I wonder what it is. So I said, well, maybe I'll really work hard in school and, do well. So I was Dean's List for 5 years. I got involved in a lot of student activity. And the pinnacle of my recognition occurred as a senior. They have a leadership honorary called ANAC, and so they call your name out at the dome, the Georgia Tech dome. You walk down. There's 3,000 or 4,000 students there, and while you walk down, they're calling out all your accomplishments. And I always looked to that, and I thought, if I can do that, I will have arrived. That's the accomplishment side of things. I remember walking down there, turning around, looking back, and I almost laughed out loud. Because I'd worked so hard for that, thinking that that would be the thing that would really fill this vacuum. And it turned out when you achieved it, it didn't really do the job. And I think many of us can identify with that. Is there anything wrong with achievement, by the way? No. Only if it's the thing you're using to fill the hole in the soul. So I was pretty much into self, filling the hole in the soul. And when I didn't achieve it from that recognition, I thought, well, my challenge is my goal's not high enough. So I made plans to go to Harvard Business School. The summer before I went up there, I'd met a young lady on a trip to Europe. We made plans to get married in the middle of my first year. And my buddies came up to me at my final party here in Atlanta, and they said, Cook, you've really got it made. You're going to Harvard Business School, you met the girl that you're going to marry. And I was far too modest to say, agree out loud, but I had to agree that I did have it made. And then I got up to Boston, middle of my first year at Harvard. First of all, pretty hard environment academically. Secondly, the sun just didn't seem to come up much. It was always kind of dark, dreary. And this love relationship I thought I had with this young lady got dissolved because of two strong egos batting themselves against each other. And I suddenly came to grips with this witness that God had planted in my heart. The creation, the conscience, and the recognition that maybe there's a God behind everything. So I prayed a prayer for the first time I'd ever prayed, because it was from my heart. And I got down on my knees one day and I said, God, if you're real, I want to know you. Now, usually I prayed from my head. God help me in this class. God help Susie. God help Joe. We don't want to, be late. God help us out. Those are head prayers. But I was praying from the heart. And an interesting thing happened. I'm going to class and I experienced this peace in my life. I immediately thought it was psychological, so I forgot it. Next day I go to class again, I pray this prayer again, and this peace comes over me. And I thought, maybe God's real. I went over to the Harvard bookstore, walked in and asked for a Bible, and they said, a what? They had them on the back shelf. I put one in a brown paper bag and smuggled it back into my room. And I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. And what happened is, God took His Word, which is what we're going to be studying, and He started filling it in the holes of my heart and my life. And what I began to see is that He had a plan for my life to take me from self-centered, accomplishment-centered, relationship-centered, to God-centered. That's what Paul is going to do in this church at Philippi. I've gone over it a little bit this week. I will be better on that. But next week, I want us to see how Paul goes about doing that. How he takes this creation, the conscience, and the message of the gospel into a Western culture, and he creates this dynamic church that ends up shaking the Roman Empire. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for our time together today. We love you, and we ask that you would teach us what you want us to learn this year in Jesus' name. Amen.